All right. Thank you, Shannon. Okay, so just for a little bit of background, I'm Haley Sater. I'm the ag educator in Wycomico County, Maryland. So I'm on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula, for anybody who isn't familiar with Maryland geography. And blueberries and blackberries and raspberries can all be grown throughout Maryland and most of the mid-Atlantic. And I will be talking to you about growing all of them. Hopefully, you didn't come for other small fruits like grapes. Those will not be in this talk, but I think blueberries and blackberries and raspberries is plenty for a 1 hour lunch talk. All right. So just a little bit of kind of background about small fruit and berries in the US. Reasons why you would grow them, well, they're high value crops. So they're you can sell them at a high price, but also they're easily sold at summer markets. You can grow them on small acreage and be highly profitable. I just really appreciate the consumer trends that have been very favorable towards berries in the last couple of decades. So if you look at average American berry consumption, from the year 2000 to 2015. So this is already old information, and I would assume that it's gone up since. We eat double as many fresh berries as we used to in the US. So there is strong consumer demand, and I think, at least in my area, I see strong consumer demand for locally produced berries, and we are not meeting that demand. Um, there are also new and improved cultivars with better fruit quality, so larger berries, berries that store longer, so they have better shelf lives, firmer berries, berries with even better flavors than what you remember. So I think it's an exciting time to be getting into the small fruit industry. Um, so I kind of already alluded to the fact that we're not meeting demand, but basically consumer spending on fresh fruit and vegetables has been going up, but relative to production. So people and anybody who's been to the grocery store, this is some old data, but prices are up, but consumers still want these fresh products. Um, And then just kind of another look at why it would make sense to grow small fruits in the mid-Atlantic. Maryland is one of the most densely populated states in the US. It means that um, a lot of our land is quite expensive to buy, but uh, if you are looking for consumers to buy your product fresh, which is where you will get the best prices with something like small fruits, you have plenty of markets and really high population density to take advantage of. So a little bit of background on blueberries, blackberries, and raspberries. They are all native to areas of the mid-Atlantic. So it's one other reason to promote these crops or, something to tell your consumers. Most crops that we grow in the US are not native to the US. I think the only agronomic crop that we grow that's native to here is like sunflower, but all of these fruits are. So we'll start off with blueberries. Blueberries are near and dear to my heart. A, because they're my favorite fruit, but B, because I did my graduate research on blueberry breeding, genetics and flavor and production. So, um, what we'll talk about next is the soil that blueberries need, but basically, Maryland has a lot of different, highly variable soil types throughout the state. And where I'm at on the eastern shore in Wycomico County, we have sand soil. In other parts of the state, you have a lot more clay or heavier soils and very rocky soils. You may not have those soils exactly where you are, but in general, we see a lot of very different soil types. But you can grow blueberries on any of these. You will just have to make adjustments and amendments to the soil to support blueberry production, because really none of these soil types are ideal for growing blueberries. So the soil that blueberries actually want to grow in is soil with very high organic matter. So it needs to have organic matter of upwards of 3%. Um, where I'm at on the Eastern Shore, especially as you're getting closer to Delaware, we just have absolutely sand textured soils with pretty low organic matter, especially if they have been commercially farmed and regularly tilled, or if they were in vegetable production. So a lot of these soils are, and what you want for blueberries are well draining soils. Um, and ideally, you would have a sandy loam. So we have sandy soils here. The loam is higher, usually means you have a little bit higher organic matter. And so, in order for me to achieve that here on the Eastern Shore, I have to add organic matter. So, if you have sandy soils, you probably have too low of organic matter, so you can add that in different ways. Um, if you have heavier textured soils, if you have a lot of clay, this is a problem because clay soils will hold too much moisture for blueberries. I would say of most uh, perennial fruit crops, blueberries have some of the weakest root systems, especially compared to trees, grapes, and even the brambles. Blueberries have roots that were evolved to grow in bogs with high organic matter and low soil pH. So they don't really like clay. If they sit in too much water, they will eventually succumb to a root rot disease, usually. So if you have a clay soil, one thing you can do is grow your blueberries on raised beds. And you can amend those raised beds with some of the stuff that we'll talk about in the next slide. So most people will not have the ideal pH for growing blueberries. If you're just taking a piece of farmland that has been in commercial production. And so ideally, you want your soil pH to be between 4.5 and 5.2. It can get up to 5.5, but higher than that, you will begin to have um, nutrient deficiency problems. Blueberries are one of the only plants that really need these low soil pHs that you're going to grow commercially, um, other than cranberries, but there's not a lot of cranberry production here, at least in Maryland. So, things you can do to amend the soil to bring down pH, but also potentially add organic matter. You can use pine products. So pine needles, if you have an abundance of those can help lower soil pH. Pine bark is what I see used commercially more for large blueberry scale planting and production. And then if you want to throw more money at it, you can use peat moss. Peat moss is going to be more expensive than pine bark, but it's going to be finer, has a very high water holding capacity, unlike pine bark. Pine bark is going to give you better drainage. Peat moss is going to be better if you're in sandy soils and you want a little bit more moisture holding capacity um, in in that soil. Um, and now so these will kind of help bring down soil pH a little bit, but you're probably not going to achieve that 4.5. If your soil pH was at, say, 6.2, and you want to get it prepped and ready for blueberries, just adding pine bark as a soil amendment or in the hole that you dig to plant blueberries, that is not going to be enough. You will need to add some form of sulfur to really reduce your soil pH. And the easiest and cheapest way to do that is to buy elemental sulfur, which comes either in pellets or in powder form. The picture there is powder, and it should be yellow. So the way you put out sulfur is you just spread it and then incorporate it into your soil. So you want to do this at least a half year to a year in advance of planting. And the reason is that the sulfur doesn't immediately acidify the soil. It needs to be digested and broken down by soil microbes, so bacteria that live in the soil, and then it will be turned into forms of acid, basically, that end up lowering soil pH. So the way I did this when I planted blueberry variety trial sites at our research farms is I used this powdered sulfur. And what I will tell you, having done this myself, you want to wear clothes that you are going to throw away when you do the sulfur spreading because obviously it's sulfur and it stinks and you will never get that smell out of those clothes. So I would recommend if you have a Tyvek suit or something plastic, wear that on top. But even then, plan to get rid of those clothes, whatever you do when you spread sulfur, because it will not come out. Um, if you're lucky, you can find sulfur pellets. Those are a little bit easier to deal with, but they take even longer to break down in soil. And if you're spreading sulfur in the winter, those soil microbes are dormant and you need to wait a full growing season to have that activation effect of the acidification of the sulfur. So if you were to say spread the sulfur in October and you wanted to plant in spring, that's too early because the sulfur isn't going to have done its job. You could plant the next fall. Ideally, you can plant in spring or fall. Okay. So then, of course, the next question is how much sulfur do I need? Um, and so this is a table that is basically the recommended amounts of sulfur. I think this is pounds per acre needed to lower your soil pH from these different numbers. So if your soil pH was 6 based on your soil test, and you think you have a very sandy soil, you need 530 pounds of sulfur that you're going to spread across the whole acre to bring it down to 4.5, your soil pH. If you would like help calculating the amount of sulfur to use on a small area or on a large area, I'm happy to help with that because there's a lot of math, but also some guesswork to doing this correctly. So this is what it looked like when I planted my trial site. So you can see um, we got the ground prepped and then we dug out these holes and we spread pine bark all through the rows where the blueberries were going to be planted. And then this is pine bark in piles that got put into the hole with each blueberry plant. And they have done really well in that site. When planting blueberries, you want your uh, spacing and density to be no more than 3 plants per square or per linear 3 feet, so within the row. Um, if you space them out to 6 feet between plants, then you'll be able to walk around the plant. If you get further apart than 6 feet, you can fit more plants than that in an area. Let's see here. Okay. Uh, you want a minimum of 8 feet between your rows. This is because you want to be able to drive at least a mower down these rows. If you have larger equipment, like say a tractor or a small sprayer, if you have any kind of commercial fogger sprayer that you would be using on your farm, make sure that your rows are wide enough to accommodate that equipment. And then raised beds for drainage is always a good idea if you are in a place with heavy textured soils. I did not do this on the lower eastern shore because my soil is very sandy. but if I thought I was at risk of having standing water in the field, this would be a good idea. I do not think I'm at risk of that because the soil drains so well. So, using irrigation. Um, and if we were further south, I would say it's a must. I still think it's a really good idea to have irrigation, especially because blueberries have a long, uh, a 30-year potential lifespan in commercial production. So at least a few of those years, we're going to have a significant drought. If that drought happens during blueberry fruit development stages, so in the spring into the summer, then you're going to lose yield. So it's always a good idea to have irrigation. Um, in general, we recommend to have drip irrigation, but some folks have overhead irrigation. And then one thing very important for blueberries is to test the water pH of your irrigation source. So a lot of wells that may be dug uh, may have high bicarbonates, so they may have very high pHs. And so that means that every time you irrigate, you're adding um, you're adding these bicarbonates that are going to make the soil more alkaline. So you may need to add acid back to the soil through your irrigation water to prevent your soil from losing that acidity that blueberries like. A way you can do this with a commercial system is to have an injector that adds something like diluted sulfuric acid, and you can run that through your irrigation pump. But I'm not going to explain how to do that per se in this presentation. Nutrient management. So, uh, balancing your nutrients is always important. If you're growing blueberries commercially, we would say that you want to get a leaf tissue sample every summer or at the beginning of the summer to make sure that your blueberries are healthy and have all of the macro and micronutrients they need. Um, One thing I will say is um, adding a lot of organic matter to your soil can tie up your nitrogen. So if every year you're adding um, fresh mulch, especially if it's never add hot mulch, so like freshly cut up mulch to a blueberry system. But even if you're adding, I know a lot of folks can get free mulch from tree companies. It's okay to add that, but just know if you're going to add it, first age it, and if you're going to add it, know that you may have to apply more nitrogen to balance out the carbon that you're adding to your system. So, um, also, low pH soils can tie up nutrient availability. So if your pH gets below that 4.5, then it starts to be a problem for a whole bunch of nutrients and can lead to aluminum toxicity in the soil. So um, uh, just making sure that you know where your soil pH is and doing tissue analysis and at least a soil test once per year is best practice for commercial blueberry production. Sources of nitrogen. This is really important for blueberries. This is not going to be important so much for most of your other crops, or at least for blackberries and raspberries. But for blueberries, you need to use acidifying or more acidic you need to use specific forms of nitrogen. So the rule of thumb is if your pH is below 5, you can use urea, which is a fairly cheap form of nitrogen. If your pH is above 5, you can use ammonium sulfate because that will be even more soil acidifying than urea. Do not use nitrate forms of um, nitrogen, or at least don't use exclusive nitrate-based forms of nitrogen. And the reason is because um, this is nitrate right here, or this is a nitrate form of nitrogen. Um, if you only give blueberries nitrates, they will not be able to absorb them, and eventually you kind of poison the roots. So they don't have enough of an enzyme that converts nitrate into ammonia, which most plants have. So that's the reason you have to be particular about your nitrogen fertilizer. Pests and diseases. There are a lot of blueberry pests and diseases, so I'm not going to go over them all, but uh, a lot of times there may be more than one problem happening at once. So my advice to you, if you're seeing a pest or disease, is to call somebody in extension, take a picture of it, and or if you are a commercial producer, we have a plant diagnostic lab that's located on the University of Maryland campus, and I send samples up there to have them tested for specific pathogens because I can't do that diagnosis in my county office, but they have a lab up there that can. I can also give you my best guess as to what I think is going on if you contact me. There are some helpful tools and guides specific for blueberries. Michigan State Extension has a really nice pocket guide to IPM scouting in highbush blueberries. So the reason I like this guide and that I keep it with me and I take it with me when I go out to the field is because it has pictures of all of the diseases and all of the insects and mites and pests. So instead of just reading about a disease, you can actually see what it looks like on blueberries, and then even physiological disorders. And so you can download this for free on Michigan State's website. If you just Google it, or if you send me an email, I can send it to you too. Another handy guide that I use, and it's specific to the Mid-Atlantic, so I think it's pretty good for Maryland producers, is the guide that comes out of Rutgers every year. So New Jersey has a lot of commercial blueberry production, so they have this commercial blueberry pest control recommendations. So this has a spray schedule for um, disease management. It also has one of these for insect management, and even weeds. So, in addition, they have all of the products that are labeled for blueberries that you can use at different times in the year. But I like that they have these sort of timelines so you can have an idea, at what point in the season to look for which diseases, right? So, if we're at bloom, we should be looking for anthracnose and blossom blight. Okay. Another thing to recognize, because I've seen this, especially with folks who may be new to growing blueberries, when you're trying to do weed control, it's really important that you know what pesticide injury looks like, because if you're using a non-selective pesticide, or sorry, a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate, you can injure blueberries if you get a little bit of drift on them. So know what these different types of damages look like. Usually you can just Google glyphosate injury on blueberries and see what that looks like. Okay, so um, perennial weeds, I would advise you don't plant into a field with lots of perennial weeds in it, because the perennial weeds are going to be even more of a challenge than annual weeds. So the biggest or the most challenging weeds to overcome in blueberries, especially when you're getting them established, so in the first few years of growth, are going to be Bermuda grass. It's terrible. Milkweed, nutsedge, mulberries are actually really bad. They're hard to cut down. You can't get rid of them. Virginia creeper, Bindweed is terrible, and Canadian thistle. So if you know you have a lot of these, it is helpful to take care of them before you plant blueberries into that site. As far as weed control, blueberries just kind of aren't very good the first couple of years at outcompeting weeds. They don't grow that much per year. So if you have a lot of weeds, a blueberry planting can start to look like this. And then you're going to have decline. You're going to lose some plants if they are outcompeted by weeds. So one thing you can do is mulch. Um, you can throw mulch on top of your rows every year. This is helpful, and just make sure that you're not raising the pH. Um, Pine bark mulch is best, but if you only have access to kind of a random assortment of mulch because you're getting it from tree cutters, just keep in mind the what I said earlier about all of the mulches, but it does make a good weed barrier. Um, so yeah, if you are an organic producer, weeds are going to be probably one of your biggest challenges, I think. And you may want to consider using something like a plastic thick mulch that they use in landscaping, because that way you won't have to spray any products. Another thing you could do is a living cover between your rows. I would say most producers around here do that anyway. You can grow grass in between the blueberries, especially if you have a U-pick. This is attractive for consumers. They like this. Um, if your weeds are going out of control, maybe you can use a cultivator of some kind if you have that type of equipment. Otherwise, something that's becoming more popular in other parts of the world is containerized blueberry production. So I haven't seen a lot of this, but growing whole blueberry plants in pots, I mean, I've seen it, but I haven't seen it done so much in the mid-Atlantic. So they're growing blueberries commercially in pots in California, in South America. So I think certain places are adopting this because it's easier than manipulating the soil to get it right. So people just, you can fill up a 5 gallon bag or container and grow. Um, so as little as 5 gallons a blueberry needs to grow in. I would say 10 gallons is probably a better size to grow a blueberry plant in. Um, Also, a lot of these systems where they're growing blueberries in containers are in warmer places than here, and then blueberries generally don't live as long as they live in our system. So we actually get more life, more years of production out of blueberries. Okay. Oh, I see that somebody is using a 20-gallon um, mineral tub to grow blueberries. Yep, that's plenty big. They have weak, small root systems, so okay. Um, just a couple of cultivar recommendations for you guys. Um, the University of Delaware did a variety trial and they published a list of varieties that they recommend growing on the Eastern Shore in 2019. And so cultivars that they recommended were Chandler Legacy Blue Crop, Lenore, and Sweetheart. They do not recommend Toro Liberty, Bonus Star, um, Arlen, Misty, or Hannah's Choice. And if you want to read more about these varieties, I think this information is still up on their website, or I can get it to you. Um, I also have another list of cultivars that are recommended by the former now New Jersey blueberry breeder. And so he had many years of experience growing blueberries, and he has a little bit to say about all of these different variety types. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I can send you this stuff over email. Here at the University of Maryland, we have a variety trial with 14 different cultivars that I started back in 2001. We will have some data from this trial soon, but basically I started tiny plants in the fall of 2021, and these are the varieties that we're growing. All of these varieties came from Fall Creek Nursery, which is, I think they're the biggest blueberry nursery out of Oregon. But they mostly sell to commercial producers. So some of these varieties may not be available if you are only ordering in small quantities. I think in general you have to be ordering large quantities, so 500 plus plants total. Um, Bird netting. If any of you have already grown blueberries, you know how much birds love blueberries. They love blueberries more than they love blackberries, raspberries, grapes. I just think I have the most trouble with birds on blueberries. And so this is a picture I took actually in Romania, where they are growing acres of blueberries under nets because the birds are such a big problem. Um, so what I all I there aren't a lot of products to keep birds off of blueberries. There are some products that you can spray or bird deterrents. There are a lot of different strategies, including lasers and uh, noisemakers, uh, but bird netting is one way that you can keep the birds away. And it does make commercial sense if you have a small planting. I think if you have under a fourth of an acre, you're going to have a really tough time with birds, especially if you have a lot of birds around you because you have forest or something like that. Okay. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. I know I just love to talk about blueberries. Um, Blueberries do require cross-pollination. Or sorry, that means you have to have at least two varieties to get good fruit. It's possible to grow just one variety, and you will get some fruit, but your fruit will be larger and you will have higher yields if you grow two or more varieties. You also need to have bees. So if you are commercially growing blueberries, you should be renting hives or you should have your own hive that you're putting out to get effective pollination. And the same is true for blackberries and raspberries, that they need pollination, but they don't need that cross pollination. So you can grow just one variety of blackberry or raspberry and get adequate pollination. Uh, Most of the pruning that you're going to be doing should be done in the winter for blueberries. And the rule of thumb is that you want to remove 1 out of 6 canes, and these should be the oldest or the thickest looking canes from the crown. So basically, if you look at this picture, they took out a few canes and then they take out um, they may have taken out, they didn't take out very many of these thick ones, but you want to take out a lot of the branchiness too, so that you don't end up with a really thick canopy, because you need air circulation and you also need light penetration. Um, okay, let's see. All right. Crop budgets. So I'm not going to go into this, but it is fairly expensive to grow blueberries at the at the commercial level. If you would like information about how to budget or what to expect crop budget wise, I can get you some of this information because, again, Rutgers University does a lot of work with that. Okay, so moving on to blackberries and raspberries. Oh, I'm going to ignore my phone. Okay. I love blackberries too. I think they are overall much easier to manage than blueberries. There are a lot of good new cultivars of blackberries that have been released really in the last 30 years. Also, there are all these new thornless varieties of blackberries. So if you're thinking, I don't want to mess around with those jokers, they have thorns as big as my thumb. Not true anymore. We have thornless varieties. There are both primocane and floricane fruiting cultivars. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. Um, the size of blackberries has improved tremendously. So there are like some blackberries that average 10 grams in weight. So that's getting closer to strawberry size. And their shelf life has improved a lot with some of these new varieties. So, um, okay. All right. Just so you know, we have a couple of resources on our website about growing blackberries in the Mid-Atlantic, and then also about selecting cultivars that make sense for you. And this is specifically thornless cultivars that you can grow here in the Mid-Atlantic, and then there when the fruit should be ready. These are on two different separate fact sheets on our website. Okay, so blackberries and raspberries, sorry, they are very genetically closely related because they're in the same family. Um, they both like high organic soil, or sorry, higher organic matter in their soils of at least 2%. So they're not as fussy as blueberries, but they still like high organic matter soils. Ideally, the soil should be well drained. So again, if you're in a place with a lot of clay, you can build raised beds. Um, and if you have sandy soils like I have, you can add organic matter. But they're not as fussy about the pH thing. So, or at least their pH range, their ideal pH range is closer to that of most other plants. So between 5.8 and 7. That also means that you can't be growing blueberries and raspberries and blackberries in the same area because they do need very different pHs. You can grow raspberries and blackberries close to one another, though. So, both blackberries and raspberries have a similar life cycle. They belong to the rubus genus, and they grow on these biannual canes. So that means the cane lives for 2 years, and then the actual planting of a blackberry or a raspberry can last between 10 and 20 years. You'll start to notice decline, usually, I think by year 15, your yields are going to go down. But what's going to happen is every year the plant will put out these new canes called primicanes. It's going to make a lot of underground rhizomes, so these primicanes can pop up everywhere. Um, then the canes from last year. So last year's primicanes become the floricanes, and they're called floricanes because they will produce the flowers that then create fruit. So, a little bit of caution about commercial production of raspberries on Delmarva. I think that it's a little bit too hot here on the Delmarva Peninsula to ideally grow raspberries. We tend to have issues with the heat. You get a lot of problems like this, sun scald. And then raspberries are a little bit more delicate. They have less firm flesh usually than blackberries or blueberries, so they have shorter shelf lives. And unfortunately, I don't really know of any breeding programs that are happening in the South to make to make raspberries more heat tolerant. Now, if you are in a more northern or westernly part of Maryland, or if you're in Pennsylvania or New York, or New Jersey, you can probably grow black or raspberries um, just fine. So, if switching back to blackberries now, these are the thornless cultivars that we or that you can read about in our fact sheet, but that really exist. Most of these are from or released by the University of Arkansas. If they have a name like Apache or Arapaho, if it sounds like a Native American name, they came from Arkansas. If they have what I call a space name, Galaxy or Eclipse, then they came from the USDA's breeding program out in Oregon. And we are trialing some of these here in Maryland because we're not really sure how well they're going to do here. But it's interesting to try some new varieties. Um, these here in green, this Primark series of Freedom, Horizon, and Traveler, these are primocane fruiting varieties. So what I just told you about blackberries and raspberries only making fruit on the second year canes or the floricanes, that's not true for every variety. So if you have a primocane fruiting variety of blackberry or raspberries, they can make fruit in the first year. That said, they will make the fruit late in that first year. So it'll be closer to fall by the time they are fruiting. So keep that in mind. And if they have a very big primocane fruit load, they will usually have a diminished or like uh, less yield on their floricane crop in the subsequent year. So, okay. Um, As far as new blackberry cultivars, most of them are considered semi-erect plant structure or highly erect, which means that you still have to have a trellis to grow them, and I'll talk about that. But they're a little bit easier to train, which we can talk about in a little bit. Yeah, most of these breeding programs are Arkansas, North Carolina releases a couple, or they're coming from Oregon. And then some of these new primocane fruiting varieties, yeah, so I talked about you usually get lower floricane yields, and then the other thing I don't like about having fruit in the fall is that that's when we really have high populations of spotted wing Drosophila and other pests. So I really don't love having fall fruit. I like to have the fruit early in the season, and I just want to deal with floricane fruiting varieties. But that is me personally. This is a little bit of information from a research trial that we did a few years back. The University of Maryland did. This is kind of before I started. Um, this was at our research station at Upper Marlboro, and they harvested these varieties of blackberries: Arapaho, Freedom, Natchez, Osage, Ouachita, and Vaughn. And Osage, Ouachita, and Vaughn really did the best yield-wise. Uh, so now I have a new blackberry cultivar trial that has a lot of different varieties. We have it planted at 3 sites. So one is in Keedysville, out in Western Maryland. One is at the Y Research Station, very close to the bridge. And one is in Salisbury, which is where I'm located. As far as red raspberries and gold raspberries go, these are some of the varieties that you can grow in the mid-Atlantic. I am not growing all of these, but I think I do have Anne at home, and I like Anne. It has a white fruit flesh. It's, yeah, I think it tastes pretty good. Um, Caroline is another good variety for this area. Crimson Giant, if you want a good late season variety. Crimson Knight. Uh, Joan Jay, I'm highlighting this one because it's thornless or mostly thornless. And then Heritage is another one that has some good flavor. I think Polka is one that one of the farmers I work with who grows these. I think he really likes Polka. Okay, and if you're interested in growing black or purple raspberries, these are still a type of raspberry, but they're a little bit uh, the the plants behave a little bit differently than red raspberries. There are a couple of purple varieties. I have heard that royalty, I haven't tried it, but I've heard that the fruit flavor is not great. Um, but there aren't a lot of varieties to choose from. If you're going to grow black raspberries, I think we recommend Jewel and Bristol specifically. Okay. Planting blackberries, again, you want to plant them no closer than 3 feet. There are folks that plant them 2 feet apart, but I would say 3 feet is fine. They'll fill in that space, and then probably not further than 6 feet apart. And then you want a minimum of 10 feet between rows. And honestly, I would recommend having at least 20, or sorry, 12, so that you can drive equipment between those rows. You do need trellises for blackberries. So if you just look at this picture here, this is an eye trellis. Um, Blackberries need this trellis for support when they start to grow a lot of foliage, but also when they start to have this heavy fruit load in the summer. You will be glad that you built a good, strong trellis to support your blackberries. The other types of trellises, and these are actually a little bit better for commercial production, are V trellises and T trellises. V and T trellises are better than I trellises in that they allow more air circulation in the canopy. And so in general, you have higher yields if you build a V or a T trellis. Okay. Um, as far as building these trellises, you want to make sure you use a good, strong material as your post, especially at the end of the trellis. So, especially if you could get a hold of telephone wires, those work great. Um, you can use T-posts in between. So this is a V trellis in this top picture here. And yeah, you can go out and get these T-posts, or you can use wooden posts. Um, the two wires, you want to have two wires on this trellis system, where the top wire should be a heavier grade of wire, which would be something like a 12.5 gauge, and your bottom wire can be a less thick wire. So you can use a 14 wire gauge. Or if you want, you can use two 12 gauges, but you want to make sure that that wire is strong enough to hold the weight of the fruit load during production. Yeah. Okay. Tipping. Tipping is basically summer pruning that you do on blackberries. You don't do this, it's possible that you need to do this on raspberries if they grow too tall, but in general, tipping you're going to do for blackberries. You do this when the canes reach 8 inches above your top wire. So depending on how tall you are, you could put that top wire in different places. But basically, when um, the main cane has reached a height at which you don't want it to get any taller, you tip it, and you need to do that when the tissue is soft and pliable. Um, and then after you tip, if you're growing commercially, we would say spray a fungicide because you've just wounded that plant. We don't want any diseases to get in. Um, and make sure you're using clean grower shears if you're cutting this off with pruners. So tipping is helpful in that it spurs the plant to make more lateral growth, which will actually cause it to yield more in the second season. You're usually, when you do tipping, you're tipping the primicanes, not the floricanes. Okay, you're also going to do winter pruning for blackberries, and you would do this for raspberries as well, because you need to prune out dead wood. You need to prune out anything that fruited in the summer because those are now dead. Um, and so yeah, prune out floricines that have already fruited, prune out laterals. So these would be, this right here is a lateral. It's a secondary growth off of the main cane. Those should not be longer than 14 inches. Remove most of these low laterals. So see here, we don't really want to be harvesting fruit here, and it might end up on the ground. So we prune those off. And then, of course, remove any dead tissue. Anything that's obviously dead, take out of there. Um, a trailing cultivar. So I've talked to you about these different types of uh, T and V and I trellis systems. But if you have a trailing cultivar of blackberry, which means that it's more of a vine, um, you're gonna trellis it a little bit differently. So the trailing cultivars are going to look more like this. They're going to look more like grapes, basically. And you space them out a little bit further, and then you actually tie them to the wires. You don't need you need two wires, but you don't need two wires on either side. So basically, if you have a trailing variety of blackberry, you're going to set them up on a trellis more like how grape producers set up grapes. So, okay. So, how do you know which floricanes have fruited if it's winter and they are dormant? You can usually tell what is a floricane because they are thicker, but also remnants of you can see remnants of the flower, like the bud structure, on those. So when you have a little bit of time, and you see the plants, you'll be able to recognize um, which ones are floricanes versus primicanes. Because I was just doing this the other day on my blackberries. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it. Okay. So if you're producing blackberries or raspberries commercially, I would recommend that you download this large guide that the Southeast Regional Caneberry group puts together. This has a lot of information about spray schedules, what to do about what diseases. Um, we also have some guides for the Mid-Atlantic, which I'll talk about, but this is a very comprehensive spray schedule. Um, Biggest pests in blackberries and raspberries, spotted wing Drosophila. This is ubiquitous. If if you are organically producing blackberries or raspberries, you're very likely going to be eating the larvae of spotted wing Drosophila, these gross little maggots here. And if you sell these to people and you have not been spraying for spotted wing Drosophila, they may come to you the next week and be like, I found maggots in my blackberries. And, you know, that's it's a problem. It's going to continue to be a problem. And basically, the only management strategy we have right now is to spray for it, or there is some very fine mesh, which is quite expensive, that you can use to cover plants, but I'm not going to talk about that. Another kind of much more secondary pest, but you might see it, is the strawberry clipper weevil. I've seen this on blackberries, and it's very tiny like this. But if you see broken off buds, flower buds like this, and they have like a black spot where it looked like something hatched out of them, that is damage done by the clipper weevil. You can see that how small that is compared to a thumbnail. Okay, another pest that's usually hard to see. It's hard to see the bug itself, but you'll see the evidence of the bug is the cane borer, and that makes a bulge where it has laid its eggs that then tunnel through that cane. But usually this isn't going to destroy a whole planting. Biggest pest problem I have on raspberries really is sun scald and heat stress. If you can provide raspberries with afternoon shade, if you're growing them in the mid-Atlantic, or if you're growing them, sorry, where I live on the Delmarva Peninsula, they do a little better if they can be shaded, at least in the afternoon when it's hot. Japanese beetle is my biggest pest. Um, that we also have spotted winged Drosophila, which gets worse towards the fall, at least for me, or at least I notice it more. And yeah, you can see all of these Japanese beetles on a raspberry. They love raspberries, and they're a big pest. Okay, where can you get plants? Um, in general, you're going to pay more for black or blueberries than you are for blackberries or raspberries. Sorry, I don't have raspberries on this slide because I don't commercially buy them, but a lot of places that sell blackberries also sell raspberries. And some of these nurseries sell both. So these are just a whole bunch of nurseries that I know that sell these. There aren't very many places in Maryland that you can go and just buy a whole bunch of blackberries or raspberries and get the varieties that you want or prices you want. Because if you go to a nursery down the road, you'll probably pay, $30 for a blueberry plant. So, okay. Let's see. If you're looking for places to buy raspberries or black raspberries, there is what is this? The North American Raspberry and Blackberry Association. They have a website where they have a list of nurseries for commercial growers. So you can look up some of these nurseries that are selling blackberries and raspberries. Um, there are also some berry budgets that will help you estimate your costs that Cornell puts out. And then we have a Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide. Uh, it was last updated in 2013, but we are currently working on a new version of this guide that will hopefully be available next winter is the goal. So these guides take a lot of people, like myself in Extension, to get them written and updated. So uh, we'll hopefully have one soon. All right. So I have seen a bunch of questions in the chat, and if it's all right, here's my contact information for anybody who wants any of these materials. I'll be sending Shannon my slides, but I know I have a lot of links to resources that you may want, so you can send me an email directly, and I can get you that stuff. Um, Okay, so I'm going to go back through the chat now, and if you have questions, throw them in there, and I'll see which ones I did not answer. So, let's see here. Okay, uh, do you recommend raised beds, raised bed brand manufacturers, US based? Um, I guess, no, when I'm talking about raised beds, I was talking about, just raising the soil in a mound in a line um, because if you're commercially producing blueberries or blackberries, you're not going to be paying for the infrastructure to build like a raised garden bed. But let me show you a raised bed system that we have. Okay. Well, I don't know if you can see it here, but we have a raised bed with plastic there. This is how most vegetables are grown on raised beds or strawberries. Mm. So like a tractor is going to be able to give you a raised bed. So I don't know if you can tell here, but the blueberries are on this mound of soil that's being built up by a tractor. So that's what I'm talking about when I say raised beds. Okay. And yes, we can grow blueberries in grow bags or in pots. Grow bags are probably the cheapest. And then if you do that, you want to use a commercial media. You do not want to use soil. Soil is going to be way too heavy. You should use uh, probably pine fines or pine fines mixed with peat moss and or perlite as your growing material substrate. Okay. Uh, is there a formula to help um, calculate the amount of sulfuric acid to a 55-gallon barrel of a water drip system? Are there other alternatives more natural to adjust the water? Our water is pH 8.4. Um, uh, yeah, so I don't know that I can answer this on screen right now because there are ways to calculate how much acid you need to make your water more acidic, but I think I'd have to look at your water sample. Um, The most natural way I can think of to get water with lower pH would be to collect rainwater. But as far as commercial systems, the only way, I mean, you just need to add an acid, right, of some kind. You could find some other more organic acid or some more natural form of an acid to add to your water. But the commercial method that I know of is usually using sulfuric acid. Okay, how big of a pot do you need to grow blueberries? Minimum of 5 gallons. I would recommend at least 10 gallons um, here in the mid-Atlantic. And then make sure to use a growing media. Do not use just regular soil. Regular soil will be too heavy for those roots to do well. Okay. Um, is it too late to prune? No. Just wait for a cold day, and prune now. Prune now. Yeah. Uh, can we see the last slide on pruning? Oh, sorry, I can do that. Yep. Am I over my time, Shannon?
You're fine. You're fine. I'll
Okay.
stop recording, but we can continue
Okay.
questions if anyone wants to hang on and hear any of those.
Yeah, and I'm